Hello, everybody. I am so happy to see many of my friends and some of my colleagues and some of people whom I just recently met because of the GLP workshop on the Jewish Inn. And it's been a wonderful experience, and we will be thinking about turning it into a more material body of conversations. At this point, I wanted just to say why I decided to talk about Jankiel, such a boring subject, such a subject from high school, and a subject that, in my opinion, has been a victim of a certain pedagogical, not even a strategy, but a pedagogical avoidance, negligence. Jankiel is richly deserving new readings, and it's really time to talk about him, especially in the context of the Jewish Inn. Obviously, you cannot talk about the Jewish Inn without Jankiel, and also, in a sense, without Mickiewicz's description of the judges' inn. It's not Jankiel's inn. But maybe before I even start to talk about this crazy construct called the Soplica inn, or maybe I even will not talk about this, I wanted to tell you how we will be organizing this. So here we have a small part of the Polish and there of the translation. Of course, the Polish original is doesn't require any explanation. It's self-evident. The translation is the most recent one. It was rendered into English by Bill Johnston from Indiana University. Bill is a British born translator and has translated a lot of works, has received a lot of recognition, critical and complimentary. The point is that putting together these two texts, you right away will see that he has one problem. And it's a problem that he has to create enjambments. And it's more seen, these are enjambments. See? Here. And they plug his translation throughout. But otherwise, I think it's a piece that reads well. I don't think I have to read it in extenso in Polish. It's a very long text. And I will actually even skip the main passages, the passages that are important for my argument. So, to the point. It is remarkable that Jankiel, who plays one of the most critical roles in the world of Soplicowo, has seldom been invoked in the discourse, but instead is relegated to the rank of a less important Mickiewicz's character in his epic poem, Pantadeusz. In this regard, Cyprian Kamil Norwid's claim that Jankiel is the only serious individual in the poem stands out because of its sharpness in depiction. Yet in spite of this claim, he is overlooked as a direction for potential interpretations. In general, Jankiel's significance rests in carrying out the various, often quite demanding functions ascribed to him by the host of the poem, as Kazimierz Wyka called the narrator. So, Jankiel is an innkeeper, a musician of some repute, a podrabinek, tell me who it is. Maybe Professor Kalik will tell me. I translate it as an assistant to the rabbi, the head of his family, and Father Robak's reliable and efficient emissary. In addition to these duties, he acts as a peacemaker amid ceaselessly quarreling gentry and an onerous smuggler of Polish patriotic songs. Though much is expected from Jankiel, who in spite of his advanced age just fathered a son Jankielek, there is at least one more weight that I would like to set on his shoulders. There is no doubt that Jankiel shares with Father Robak a special agency, the power to exercise the conspiratorial plans of liberating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, I don't want to engage the patriotic discourse as the most worn out, the most entrenched discourse in the case of this work. And I propose the reading of Jankiel's Dulcimer concert as a romantic improvisation, and him as a unique Jewish performer of Polish tunes, as an improvisatore, to use Alexander Pushkin's preferred word. To understand the shaping of his concert as an improvisation, I would like to compare him with what is known about Mickiewicz's own experience as an improviser. For this part, Mickiewicz became renowned for his skills at improvising during his stay in Russia, although he partook of this practice much earlier. According to the various accounts of his performances, the poet improvised in French with a strong Polish accent. So, this is the good moment to recall the late Janusz Głowacki's famous saying that an exile is a person who lost everything but his accent. Despite this distancing effect of his foreign enunciation, the witnesses were usually impressed. According to Peter Wiazemski, not only he, but also Alexander Pushkin and Wasily Zhukovsky, I'm quoting, were shaken, and I'm quoting, in awe of him. It would be difficult to know, however, what the poet actually said, as he had a very strict rule towards the presentation of his improvisation. Nobody was allowed to take notes. For example, after his performance in Chorynia, Wielkopolska, in 1831, he approached two of his listeners and said, I'm quoting, "It seems to me, gentlemen, that you took notes." The end of the quote. Then he asked for their papers, and when handed over, he threw them into the fire. His strict division between the improvised and the written poetry indicates not only the strength of his sense of perfection and ultimate desire to control his own work, but also a deep understanding of the ephemeral quality of the performative genre of improvisation. Nonetheless, he clearly did not accept the popular, at the time, notion that improvisation was a form of light entertainment, or that it could be a merely mechanistic performance, as Vladimir Odojewski envisioned it in his Russian Nights. Here, just one quick comment. We talked today about the Italian sort of street performers in various Warsaw's courtyards. And Odojewski exactly is referring to this kind of a mechanical type of improvisation that is really like using a mechanical music instrument. Nonetheless, Mickiewicz clearly did not, usually the audience suggested the theme of improvisation. The poet eventually abandoned this rule and proposed a variety of themes of his own choice, mostly as it related to the future of Poland. This development suggests that Mickiewicz grew tired of these events and attempted to decrease the level of difficulty involved. Moreover, in doing so, he lessened the value of spontaneity. So, essential to his poetics of improvisation. As there are almost no records of Mickiewicz's improvised poems, the prevalent view is that in the heat of the moment, he did not create anything of lasting value, nor was he expected to. We have to actually mention. As Edward Odeniec remarked, verse, rhyme, and form have no significance here at all. The end of the quotation. This aside, what so impressed those who attended his performances was the charisma and the vitality of his actual physical presence, which had less to do with what he said than how he said it. What mattered most on these occasions was his fiery energy, his expressive gesture, and the ecstatic conviction in his voice. As such, all of it brought about the intensity of the affect. And I'm quoting, the essential fact of the perception of improvisation, says Viktor Weintraub, was the very look of the improviser. Unquote. Indeed, Wiazemski, a sympathetic observer of at least one of these performances, commented in a letter to his wife. And I'm quoting, "For a few minutes, the poet withdrew somberly into his inner temple. Then he stepped forward, and his facial features lightened with the flame of inspiration." Unquote. Of course, such high success and this form of improvisation depended entirely on the level of agency Mickiewicz, the improviser, exercised over his listeners. As borne out in their commentaries, his agency, as manifested through creative energy, was immediately recognized by his audience. Malinowski mentioned that on those occasions when he was present, the audience, transported with excitement, interrupted each of the poet's improvisations with rapture applause. So these probably were absolutely amazing events. Pushkin gave an exact account of the performance in the making that reflected Mickiewicz's manner of preparing for a poetic extemporization. And I am quoting, "But the improvisatore already sensed the divine presence. He signaled to the musicians to play. His face grew alarmingly pale. He trembled as if in fever. His eyes sparkled with wondrous fire. And he suddenly stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. The music stopped. The improvisation began." Unquote. Wacław Lednicki likewise picked up the Pushkinian trope of the external transformation when he pointed that an improvisation verged on the phenomenon of the total makeover of the improviser. So here's the quotation. "The essence of the miracle is hidden precisely in the fact that a man who a moment ago seemed an ordinary man, a man of normal stature and disposition, all at once has become, to those present, an invisibly captivating personality endowed with a regal power." Unquote. Another important ingredient of Mickiewicz's own theory and practice of improvising came from the painter Józef Oleszkiewicz, whom the poet met in St. Petersburg. And it is generally assumed that Oleszkiewicz introduced him to the Illuminist philosophy of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. And through this encounter, Mickiewicz was exposed to the Saint-Martinist notion of prophetic poetry as divinely inspired, and thus created extemporaneously, or to quote Saint-Martin, l'improviste. Through this net of ideas and performances, Mickiewicz came to formulate the creative act as a moment of sudden inspiration. I should note that it was not always divine, as the poet sometimes was inspired by a variety of Polish dishes or the popular, at the time, song Laura and Filon. Laura y Filon. Yet the most singular feature of his improvisation, which bridges the poet's own experiential knowledge and Jankiel's improvisation on a dulcimer, was Mickiewicz's unique manner of combining music and poetry. In his many improvisations, he shaded the difference between these two artistic languages by chanting some lines while reciting others. By modulating his voice, the poet grafted it onto one of his favorite tunes, accompanied on his musical instrument. Contemporary accounts described his voice as singing. Some were, however, less favorable. One listener went so far as to compare the poet's singing voice to the cluck of a chicken. Another listener was less judgmental and gave a more detailed rendering of the musical poetic improvisation. I'm quoting, "At the beginning, the poet was heard mumbling, or rather humming to himself quietly. Then, suddenly, the expression on his face changed. His voice acquired a strange, extended lilt that gathered strength until he actually sang the last two strophes." Unquote. Indeed, Mickiewicz stated in a rather uncompromising way that music is a voice of emotion. What is not passionate is not song-like. That was his quotation. By this practice of blending words with music, the ancient legacy that his improvisation became a part of was already inherent in the Romantic movement. Moreover, performance and creation were not considered separate in classical music. From Bach to Mozart, to Chopin, to Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann, an extemporaneous creation was on the one hand an inherent part of performance, on the other the audience expected it to take place. Thus the two modes, the partaking of new elements and ideas and that of repetition, were generally fused together. Mickiewicz, who actually listened to some of Chopin's improvisations in 1841, is very often paired and compared to Chopin's performances. And there exists a substantial, yet often impressionistic discourse on the subject. His friends and contemporaries such as Odyniec and Mirecki, later Bełza, and in the second half of the 20th century, of course, the scholar Zofia Lissa and Maria Korytowska-Cieśla have formulated opinions, gathered data, and analyzed the poet's near obsession for the voice of passion, for music. My interpretation, however, belongs to a different discourse. Indeed, my findings allow me to conclude that Mickiewicz's pattern of an extemporaneous performance emerged as a distinctive artistic phenomenon and gained coherence from a combination of certain elements such as the ephemeral quality of the spoken text, combined with an empowering visual transformation as rendered by the improviser, an affective intensity of the extemporaneous act with an ingrained sense of theater, an inspiration suggestive of a divine source, often coupled with a group of historical themes, and finally, the heightening of textual meaning through singing or quasi-singing. Moving back to Jankiel. Jankiel, the carrier of many duties, exists in two different dimensions: the xenophobic social ranking of Soplicowo and the mystified sphere of his musical performances. Soplicowo reflects the social hierarchy of the liminal time, and within this hierarchy, Jankiel, the Jewish innkeeper, seems to fall between social, professional, and artistic categories. In the poem, where an anti-Semitic bias is not censored, at all. The innkeeper acts as a virtuous man of integrity. Within his own space of the inn, he is a dignified elderly man. While outside, especially when defined contextually by the dominant gentry group, he calls himself, perhaps with a grain of salt, żydzisko. Ja sobie żydzisko. This is an interesting self-definition. The English translation of the phrase from Book 7 lost the panache with which Jankiel imposed xenophobia on his identity. I am a Jew renders, this is the rendering by Bill Johnston, renders a different meaning. Much closer would be the rendering, I am just an old Jew, as the suffix isko signifies some contempt, something large also. This is a strong, even harsh self-definition uttered to boost the sense of superiority among the nobles. It cleverly tones down his agency and, needless to say, pushes to the background his creative persona for which he was renowned. He employs this camouflage strategy in which he is aided by the narrator until the concert, during which he would undergo a powerful change combined with a difference in his perception. It is undeniable that his identity is very malleable, depending on the social framework within which he appears. Alexander Hertz stated that the more Jankiel is engaged in Polish affairs, the more he steers away from his Orthodox Jewish community. Nonetheless, the poem tries and fails to make a case for his dual identity. Of a good Jew and a good Pole, because of some qualifying words like he liked Poland, like a Pole, or almost like a Pole, a Jew. Choć Żyd, he liked Poland. He liked Poland. There is this element of qualification that is subtly nuanced, but indicates a certain crevice between him and his Jewishness and him and his Polishness. Within the vertical power structure of Soplicowo, Jankiel, as a Jewish person, is on the lower rung of the society strata, but from the perspective of identity, his performance subverts his perception, as he dominates the audience, which at the time is much larger because of the arrival of the army than the regular Soplicowo community. This subversion is determined by the manner in which he performs his music and exercises his agency. Now, just very basic words about Pantadeusz. This is a narrative poem with a plot line incorporating several passages that are formally united, yet may exist on their own. In this sense, Jankiel's Dulcimer concert, entitled by Mickiewicz The Concert of Concerts, constitutes an embedded narrative easily separated from the main body of the poem. Its 118 lines describe an act of a unique spiritual elevation, which embraces each and every person present there. Let us listen intently to these words. I will just read a few passages. Wiedzą wszyscy, że mu nikt na tym instrumencie nie wyrówna w biegłości, w guście i talencie. Proszę, żeby zagrał, podają cymbały. Żyd wzbrania się, powiada, że ręce zgrubiały. Odwykł od grania i nie śmie, i panów się wstydzi, kłaniając się umyka. Tymczasem dwaj uczniowie przy cymbałach klęczą, stroją na nowo struny i próbując brzęczą. Jankiel z przymrużonymi na poły oczyma milczy i nieruchome drążki w palcach trzyma. Spuścił je zrazu bijąc taktem triumfalnym, potem gęściej, siekł struny jak deszczem nawalnym. Dziwią się wszyscy, lecz to była tylko próba, bo wnet przerwał i w górę podniósł drążki oba. Znów gra. Już drżą drążki, tak lekkimi ruchy, jak gdyby zadzwoniło w strunę skrzydło muchy, wydając ciche, ledwie słyszalne brzęczenia. Mistrz zawsze patrzył w niebo, czekając na tchnienia. Spojrzał z góry, instrument dumnym okiem zmierzył, wzniósł ręce, spuścił razem, w 2 drążki uderzył. Zdumieli się słuchacze. Muzyk bierze do prymów, urywa takt, zmąca. Porzuca prymy, bierze z drążkami do basów. Słychać tysiące coraz głośniejszych hałasów. Takt marszu, wojna, atak, szturm. Słychać wystrzały, jęk dzieci, płacze matek. Rzeź Pragi, którą znały z pieśni i z powieści. Ledwie słuchacze mieli czas wyjść z zadziwienia. Znowu muzyka inna. Znów zrazu brzęczenia. Lekkie i ciche, kilka cienkich strun jęczy, jak kilka much, gdy z siatki wyrwą się pajęczej. Lecz strun coraz przybywa. Już rozpierzchłe tony łączą się i akordów wiążą legiony. I już w takt postępują zgodzonymi dźwięki, tworząc nutę żałośną tej sławnej piosenki. The relevance of Mickiewicz's own improvisational paradigm to Jankiel's performance stems from his moment of concentration, which precedes the actual performance and the theatrical gesture of raising his hands and looking aloft. The narrator's explanation indicates that this is his usual behavior while he awaited inspiration. Directing his gaze above the heads of his audience, he seems to seek stimulation from above, which in Max Scheller's terms is creating a situation in which the performance subjectivity is complemented by the sacrum, the element of the sacrum. If so endowed with such support, Jankiel could facilitate a transmission of the divine. Much of his internal metamorphosis is registered and translated from the visual data to the verbal by the closely observing narrator. Looking rejuvenated after the intense and successful performance is a natural reaction, but Jankiel's inner change confirms that he was spiritually, divinely motivated. I'm quoting in his it's here. In his gaze, replete with spirit, there shone a useful blaze, unquote. The inner change, reminiscent of Mickiewicz's own practices, is translated in the language of the visible. Quid est in externo, est etiam in interno, as Neoplatonists would have it. From the perspective of identity construction, his performance subverts his subjectivity as he dominates over the audience, which at the time of the arrival of the Polish army is really substantial. And the transformation that he is undergoing is a side of a paradox. Although a sudden one, the change is prearranged without triggering suspicion on the part of the audience. This is something that has to happen. A spontaneous creation is not just, as Wordsworth would say, a spontaneous flow of powerful feelings, but it is also something that comes suddenly and takes a person, like, almost an act of grace, unexpectedly. Jankiel's reluctance and excuses, such as his lack of preparation, are necessary steps to guarantee the spontaneity of his performance. Romantics viewed the working of creative imagination as stemming from human emotions. For them, it was natural. It was a natural lived experience. In Pantadeusz, this claim gains more emphasis because the authentic Jankiel is juxtaposed to the pure artifice of another character, the Count, the character who's posturing as an artist, who confuses authentic emotions with learned aesthetic conventions and pretense. The Count operates through affectation, not through the affect. Contrary to him, Jankiel has at his disposal both an affect and agency, two powerful tools that go one after another and sometimes hand in hand to problematize anew the question of an asymmetric interaction between the individual and the collective subjectivities. During this process, the power exerted by him is fused with his impact on others. The concert subverts his secretive clandestine agency, the subject of rumors and limitations in Saplicovo, and the latter caused by anti-Semitic prejudice. The text is foregrounding the fact that Mickiewicz is, that Jankiel is a virtuoso. Actually, this is the term that Johnston uses. He is not using the term master. The supreme performative quality of his composition does not escape his audience, as the listeners closely follow and decode his descriptive music. The performer's real spiritual change and his creative substance seem overlooked as they are under his spell, in sort of a trance. In Pantadeusz, the Jewish agency embraces a creative, very intensive energy, which redefines Jankiel as a truly romantic individual. Jankiel's turning into a musical spiritual leader, endowed with a heightened, transcendent agency, dominates all his listeners without exception. His audience collectively decodes the descriptive layer of Jankiel's music and reacts emotionally. So, for example, from song to song, he moves them painfully, or he makes the audience, the peasants, quake with fear. At one point, the listeners are barely over their sensation. And another point, in the end, they all applaud, the chorus crying out loud. Dąbrowski march actually becomes a truly Tirtean call to arms. Most of the time, their reading of this descriptive music is correct. Only once they are confused, but the steward, Klucznik, interrupts this collective emotion of confusion by recognizing the seemingly false note as an expression of the treason in Polish history, the different than the delight Wiesemski and Pushkin had shown is undoubtedly facilitated by the content, the usage of popular tunes and songs. He chaperones his audience through the turbulence of Polish history, and his extemporization of past defeats stimulates a cathartic reaction. In fact, the listeners at one point are brought to tears by the music. The triumphant notes of the finale reach the climax of the improvisation. That's the really the pivotal moment. The performance reconstructs Polish national history, shaping through memory and experience what this may potentially mean for a brighter future and the people of the brighter future. In regards to Jankiel's status, his gradual transformation is reflective in terms of increasing returns. Thus, Jankiel, introduced in Book 4 as a musician of repute, is elevated to a higher status when the semantically charged word master is introduced and then repeated many times over at various subtly nuanced points of the text. And once he's called mistrz doskonały, a perfect master in my literal translation. This ennobling gesture elevates his existing status to the highest possible rank. And here Mickiewicz exercises something more than a daring gesture of emancipation and romantic inclusiveness, for the humble Jew turns into the supreme master, mistrz doskonały, a virtuoso, as Bill wants it. A virtuoso unlike any other virtuosi. Jankiel's burst of creativity and his affective impact on the audience, all united through his music, position him above the Soplicowo, a society within which he ceases to be a complete outsider or an outsider. He demonstrates through his performance that he richly deserves his fame that is mentioned earlier. Since this whole transformation constitutes the core of this extraordinary event, I would like to refer to the concept of his transformation to the concept of an aristocracy of spirit. Now it's a quite outdated and even pretentious, nonetheless, a high ideal during the 18th and 17th century. I would argue that Mickiewicz somewhat perversely endowed Jankiel with this distinction, which at the time did not bespeak just of a life of privilege or disregard for the trivial or mundane conditions of life, but of embracing high spiritual values. This manner of mythologizing Jankiel, who, as a genius in his own right, is perhaps a folk equivalent of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. I would like to know what Andrea thinks of it. Brings the dulcimer musician closer to the poet. If so, could Jankiel be interpreted as Mickiewicz's alter ego, his own hypothesis? This would be one of the most intriguing and groundbreaking potentialities within the concert. But let me reiterate. Here we have the unprepared musician, a country Jew, an innkeeper, who undergoes a multifaceted change during which he embodies sheer inspirational grace. In this sense, the sarcastic comment that a Russian Yiddish critic, Lev Levanda, made about him turns out to contain a grain of truth. I'm quoting, "Jankiel has no head, no legs, just wings," unquote. Ultimately, Jankiel is a hovering spirit of the poem, one of the most affective beings, who competes and cooperates with another entity in the poem, Father Robak, but cooperates and competes with him. This anointment, however, does not extend further than the performance. For once the improvisation is over, Jankiel acts differently and differentially, ceasing to be an entity of affect and agency, and embraces his earlier role of a patriotic Jew. So we can go now back to right here. Terrific. Thus he appears in his new and indeed pioneering role of an aristocrat of spirit only for the duration of his dulcimer performance. In a reverential act, he kisses General Dąbrowski's hand. Simon Schama, a wonderful British art historian who visited Lithuania and described every place where his family and Mickiewicz once upon a time walked, thinks that the whole process of his transformation, that is Jankiel's transformation, is complete only when Jankiel greets Dąbrowski as the Messiah. For Schama, the highest point of Jankiel's change is to subject him to the ideology of romantic inclusiveness. As he writes, I'm quoting, "It is difficult to imagine a more complete transformation. From being an alien presence in his native land, he is made by Mickiewicz to contain its natural embodiment in the land of woodsmen and hunters." Unquote. If so, short-lived, yet lived truly, an experience proves that Jankiel, after all, has a head and legs, that he is acutely aware of the political reality and its powerful men who, like him, are on the verge of forging a dual identity. The irony of this behavior when he's kissing General Dąbrowski can't escape the reader, for the historical Dąbrowski was quite Germanized and did not speak Polish well. So we have those two characters together. As a matter of conclusion, I engaged here three strongly vertical strategies: performative, inclusive, and emancipatory, all open to a further ennobling and aestheticizing perspective. They all converge at several points, including the matter of belief in Judaism, that is, the belief that Jews have been endowed with a spiritual superiority. It is a perennial trope in Judaism. Nonetheless, Mickiewicz saw this theme differently in terms of Israel's seniority, not superiority. Marta will correct me if I am wrong. Concert of Concerts is an emancipating narrative that gestures to the wider emancipatory processes of the time, as well as anticipates several Polish Jewish biographies of the turn of the previous century. Even in this case, however, the readers, the optimistic readers, sympathetic, empathetic readers, may view Mickiewicz as a prophet. So that's all for now. I would like to say one more little thing. It's actually a postscriptum. There is one more concert in Pantadeusz. It's Wojski's concert, equally sublime, but it is sublime because of the natural force of the echo that takes the sound of Wojski's horn deeper and deeper, higher to the skies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very important and fascinating presentation. I think we have a bit of time for questions, so I invite comments and observations from the audience. Please.
So I find the comparison, your comment about the difference between improvisation and a completed work for Mickiewicz very striking, because scholars have claimed that this is exactly how Chopin also approached the question of a work, a published work, a written work, and improvisation. They were very different tasks, separate. Improvisation came easily to Chopin. Composition was blood and sweat. He was working very hard on it, and so in other words, in both cases, the written work is not the improvisation; it's a different act. So I just found it striking, and I'm just wondering whether this is just these two artists, or this is a larger phenomenon.
A larger phenomenon, I believe. Although here it is, it's executed in a wonderful verse and in a poetic text.
Well,
So
this is where a constructed improvisation.
Right.
Yeah, I was talking
So
about
it's not about Mickiewicz anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Actually, another person who engaged in improvisation was Pushkin. And
Oh, yeah, but he was not good.
is that so? Oh, well, that's...
No. Actually, he was probably a better observer, a very acute observer of what an improvisation could be. But it was a romantic type of performance.
Mikrofon.
Mikrofon.
Oh yes, we share one so I'm sorry. Well, you know, this is the spirit of the time. Everything that is unprepared, spontaneous, or seemingly unprepared and spontaneous and seemingly authentic is highly valued. The fact is that this guy, and I would like to repeat again, that this guy is an innkeeper, somebody who sells beer, vodka, somebody who is, walking within his very heterogeneous space, the space of heterotopia of styles. His inn is not, made in any consistent style that we saw in so many variations throughout our workshop. This is actually a space that is sometimes essentialized, sometimes not. So at some points it can remind the viewer of a praying Jew. Sometimes, especially its roof reminds the viewer, the narrator, of a cap, a hat that a religious Jew would wear at the time. So we have that strange shift. The narrator talks about the Goths, and without, it seems to me, any real deeper understanding of that style. It's clearly a romantic type of neo-Gothic style that he invokes. And then he talks about the temple in Jerusalem, etc., etc. Everything, literally, various temporal dimensions and various spaces are put together to create a heterotopia of styles. And then, in the middle of this, we have this amazing burst of intense change and a concert.
I wonder if I could abuse the position of the chair to ask you another question, which is, what do you think Norvid meant when he said that Jankiel was the only real person in this poem? Mm-hmm. I mean, I take the point that the three main characters are rather stereotypical, but what did he have in mind?
Well, he apparently respected the character. A serious person, Jankiel certainly was. I would like to go a little bit beyond what Norvid said about him, and actually I would like to show you. Julia, could you show us the slides? Oh, here is his drawing. Actually, an absolute romantic masterpiece. We have a sketchy, a little bit mysterious type of representation. Jankiel is in a meditative mode. He is not executed. The figure is not executed in full detail. It's more suggestive and finished, truly romantic. And the next one. And this is a palimpsest of sorts that also was performed by Norvid. Not my favorite. I think that he's a little bit like
Jesus.
Mm-hmm, well, yes, Christianized or Catholicized.
You know what it is? I actually looked very recently at a whole bunch of images like this, and the upward gaze is artistic inspiration. There is a topos in painting.
Well, I talked about this upward
exactly.
Gaze. Yeah.
So that's why it's the.
This is usually the gaze that is the gaze that is used by painters for all sorts of martyrs,
exactly.
saints.
But in that generation of painters, there are a lot of works that represent artists.
Yes.
In this way. So, for instance,
because it's the highest rank.
It's inspiration. Yeah. There is a representation, several representation of Liszt during moment of improvisation, engaging upward gaze and so forth. So that's where the sacred and secular converge in a sacralized art.
I like the quiet aura that he exudes, but there is some suffering in the face, in the features. The next one. and here you can compare what we just saw a moment ago. Norwich, very suggestive, unfinished drawing to this highly detailed, overwhelmed by details scene of Jankiel playing a dulcimer. They call it, of course, Andrioli, and he was just completely identified with the poem. But please note that this particular illustration is loaded with information, and Andrioli wants to put there everything and everybody. The next one. And Moniuszko, you can tell that he's not a very accomplished painter. I would say that the figure of the Count is probably the most successful in this group, but that's the production. Illustrations to Jankiel's concert tend to be flat or sentimental or totally artificial. Next. Marczewski. This one's a really good one, I think. A simple sketch. This is not even a drawing. This is really a sketch, a sort of a draft. Next. And Wojciech Gerson, we talked about him today. Again, the picture speaks for itself. It's not any, and although I like Wojciech Gerson, but this is not in any sense a good rendering of Jankiel.
You can't imagine this cap falling off.
No. Yes, right. And staying on his shoulder.
Yes.
Yeah. But again, the gaze is directed upward, and there is that spiritual connection. Okay. Are you on the next one? This is Maurycy Trębacz. He's the favorite of many scholars in the Polish Jewish studies. It is a sentimental kind of a rendering, but because he was he executed this work after Poland regained independence. You can see that actually the modeling of figures is already, especially the Polish characters, tends to be stereotypical. Next. Edward Levy. I apologize for the poor quality of this work. I couldn't do much about this. This is very realistic, but simple work, and I cannot say that it in any way relates to to this amazing upheaval that we observe, the change that we observe in concert over concerts, but it shows, because Jankiel is portrayed from behind. It shows a sort of his quiet, contemplative attitude, and that's a good quality of the picture. Seweryn Bieszczad, more contemporary. The same trope of the gaze going upward, and the next one. This is Józef Wilkoń, for whom who also illustrated the whole Pantadeusz, and it's for Wilkoń, Soplicowo and Pantadeusz is all about nature. So we have this huge oak tree which dominates the the gathering of people, and there is our little dulcimer player. I believe one more. Yes, don't get scared. But this is Stefan Mrożewski, once a quite popular graphic artist. For some reason, he decided to represent Jankiel as a person who just saw a ghost. Mm-hmm. But also, despite the very modernistic line, emphasis on contours and sort of a simplification, this is also a picture loaded with information. Thank you.
What's the date of this one?
It's
Approximately.
1970s. I don't remember dates. I have a very bad memory for dates.
70s.
Mhm.
70s.
Yeah, 1970s.
I really enjoyed your lecture, and I
You
really
have to speak
enjoyed-
up. I'm sorry, we don't have a mic here.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your lecture, Bożena. Thank you. But and I also, on the context of the workshop, it's interesting again that we have. I mean, we've been talking about Jewish musicians playing in the background and playing for weddings or playing for
Right.
other things. But the very fact, I've never thought about this in the years I've taught Tadeusz, but where Zosha comes out and says, "You promised that you would play at my wedding." Well, this is not at her wedding. He becomes the star performer, and he becomes then truly the maestro, the virtuoso in the spotlight, as if her wedding means nothing. I mean,
Right.
the focus is completely changed
Right.
to the story that he's telling,
Right.
and to his experiencing and his epiphany and his the visitation from on high.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And this is the revolutionary moment in his concept.
Could I argue, all of these are more or less favorable portrayals of Jankiel.
Maybe we could skip this one and go to something more
But
political.
what I would like to ask about is the Jewish national response to Jankiel was very critical. You know, Przecież
Yes.
Majufestikum Jankiel. Could you say something about that?
Well, actually, the better person would be Professor Goldberg.
I know nothing about the.
You know nothing about Majufis?
Well, about Jankiel is playing a Majufis concert.
A reprise.
Yes.
No, this is really the point that was made by Alexander Hertz, that Jankiel is appropriated or wants to be appropriated by the Polish community, and he is removed from the Jewish audience. Lev Lewanda, who is
Yeah.
very critical of Jankiel, is one of the very prominent Yiddish critics and writers in the Tsarist Russia in the second half of the 19th century. And for him, this is just, a totally unsubstantial character. That's the point. And an inspiration, a divine inspiration, defies reason.
Again, I'm sorry to appropriate the prerogative of the chair. Seeing the two Norvid portrayals, which are very striking,
Mhm.
and Norvid
There's
also,
one more.
and
actually.
Norvid also commented on it. How do you compare Norvid's poem Gigi to these, or how do you relate
Oh
it?
wow! I would probably not be able to do it. Norvid went through his own process of transformation,
Yes.
and he was making some very unfavorable, very negative comments about the European Jewry. That's what happened
Yes.
ultimately.
Well, I think there's a great deal to reflect on in this lecture, and I think we are extremely grateful to you for this virtuoso improvisation, and thank you very much. And I'd like, on behalf of everybody, to thank you, and we all go away thinking very carefully about what all this means and how we are to evaluate the way in which Mickiewicz saw this very complicated situation.
Yeah.
And Mickiewicz's, we've talked about this before, Mickiewicz's own attitude towards Jewishness and towards the Jews around him is a very complicated subject, and what you said tonight adds greatly to our understanding. So I'd like to
so
thank you
much.
on all our
That's very- Thank you.